Thank you, Olli, not just for the introduction, but also for organizing this workshop, which I think is being really interesting. I really enjoyed the day yesterday. I have to say that although I usually present myself as a scholar of esotericism, I have a background in philosophy. My first degree was in philosophy, actually, but it's a long, long time ago. So my philosophy is actually a bit rusty, but I think it's a very good idea to expand the field of esotericism and to open up new perspectives. So I think the idea of bringing esotericism and philosophy in conversation is actually very good. So I'm happy to be here today. I also have to say that most of the papers presented here at the workshop are also contributions to the book that Olli is editing. So I think they are well-rounded papers already. That's not the case with me. It's actually more of a work in progress. So I'm still thinking and I'm still working on this. So don't expect anything really too elaborate for now. And in this paper, I would like to discuss an author who is very little known outside of Italy, but not just outside of Italy. Even in Italy itself has not really been remembered that much. So there were only a few specialists or a few scholars, connoisseurs who knew his name. And his name, as you can see also in the title, is Mario Manlio Rossi. Rossi was a humanist with many interests, although I think the foremost identity, the way in which he saw himself, was mostly that of a philosopher. And it's interesting to note that in recent years, there has been a kind of Rossi renaissance with a number of publications, scholars who started to be interested again in him. There were actually 2 conferences in the last couple of years dedicated to him. And then also unpublished works that were found in his archive that were published. Most notably, an unfinished autobiography titled Memorie di un estraneo, Memories of a Stranger, that was published just a couple of years ago. But also, I should mention that from the more specific perspective of esotericism, interest was there even earlier than that. Roberto Bacci wrote a PhD dissertation that was defended in 2012, which was based on a comparison between Rossi's work Spaccio dei Maghi, on which I would also say something in this paper, and Julius Evola's Maschera e volto dello spiritualismo contemporaneo, so mask and face of contemporary spiritualism. So the whole PhD dissertation was based on these an analysis of these 2 works. Now, Rossi is certainly not a prominent figure of 20th century philosophy. He wrote many interesting works in various fields, so not just philosophy, but also the history of ideas, literary criticism. And there are 2 main reasons why his reputation remained confined in small circles, because he was a very productive scholar, and the quality of his works is actually remarkable. So one may wonder, okay, so why don't we know about him? We never heard of him. Well, the first reason is that apparently he had a very difficult character. He quarreled basically with everybody. So at one point or another, even his best friends at some point had to walk away because they couldn't stand him anymore. So he didn't have many friends. That's clear. Also in the academic world. And the second reason is that he left Italy at some point. I will return to this. He took up a position at the University of Edinburgh. And so he was in the typical situation, which is actually familiar to me, of being a little bit everywhere but nowhere at the same time, in a kind of limbo. So you don't belong to your homeland anymore, but you don't belong to the place where you are, where you live, actually. So you're in the middle of everything. And so certainly by moving abroad, he caught himself out of the Italian academic establishment. So there was also a lack of attention from Italian scholars themselves. But he was an international scholar because he published many works in English as well. So it's not just that he could have received more attention from Italian scholars, but also from international scholars. And this has been the case only partially so far. So I would like to discuss, first of all, I would like to say something about the Italian context. So the kind of context in which he moved, especially at the beginning. So we are in the early decades of the 20th century, and what you see in Italy at the time, like in many other countries actually, is a reaction against positivism and new forms of culture, but also philosophy that are opening up to spirituality, to spiritual issues. Interestingly enough, in the Italian context, this happens also through the influence of pragmatism. William James, John Dewey, there are some intellectuals, most notably Giovanni Papini, Giuseppe Prezzolini, who are not really in a strict sense philosophers, but are sort of cultural agitators. They are intellectuals who are very active, and they publish a number of periodicals together. This is La Voce. There are other periodicals that they publish, and they are really very, very active. So in spreading also new ideas, they are interested in mysticism, in spirituality. So this is also how they try to reorient Italian culture and also Italian philosophical culture. And then there is the importance of the two main figures of the Italian philosophical landscape at the time. One is Benedetto Croce and the other is Giovanni Gentile. They are also known outside of Italy. And although they started out with a similar position, a kind of neo-idealist, neo-Hegelian position, then they ended up actually in very different places, also politically, because Benedetto Croce at one point became a kind of reference for anti-fascists, whereas Giovanni Gentile became the official philosopher, so to speak, of fascism and of the regime, also in terms of thinking of elaborating a whole philosophy even of fascism. Let's not forget also that it's not just about philosophy, it's not just about this kind of intellectual activism, but there was also other areas in which especially the first 3 decades of the cultural landscape in Italy sees a lot of action, a lot of movement. And I think we should especially remember futurism. So that was the kind of homegrown artistic movement that was really a kind of avant-garde movement that was actually quite influential internationally. So especially around the First World War, there was really an intention of moving away from old canons of art, so old forms of art, and exploring new forms of creative expression. Now, something about, oh yeah, and I should also mention that in that context, what was really important was the emergence of a whole esoteric culture. So part of this very radical, sometimes even revolutionary culture, there was also the presence of particularly influential figures who played a role in sort of giving an esoteric slant to this culture. Probably the most famous figure in this context is Julius Evola, who, well, then today is also has become a particularly influential figure, especially in right-wing milieu. So there is also a political component there. He had a kind of problematic relationship with fascism, but certainly he was close enough to fascism itself, also with racist and anti-Semitic components. But this was later on. We are talking about a period where he was still actually very much involved in philosophy, also with a certain kind of radical idealism, and even in art, because he was also involved in Dadaism as an artist. He was a painter in those years. And that was, therefore, before he actually moved towards a more traditionalist kind of systematic thought that would happen after the discovery of traditionalism, of René Guénon, and so on. And the other figure was Arturo Reghini, who was a bit older than Evola, and at the beginning even played the role of a mentor for Evola. And he certainly played the role of mentor for Rossi also, because Rossi and Reghini were very, very close friends. I think Rossi was never a good friend of Evola. They knew each other, they frequented more or less the same milieus, but they were not real friends. Whereas with Reghini, there was real friendship. Okay, now a few words about Rossi and his his biography. So Rossi was born in Reggio Emilia in northern Italy in 1895, and he was the son of a notable family. His father had been the mayor of the city. He spent his childhood there and then moved to Florence for his university studies. And it should be noted that Florence was the hotbed of this radical culture at the time. So many of the figures who were really active in the intellectual landscape, including Futurism, so Prezzolini, Papini, they were all based in Florence. So Florence really played an important role at the time. Rossi became close to Futurism, was really interested in everything that was going on that was new, that was sort of innovating Italian culture, was close to the avant-garde milieus that were active in the city. And he went there basically to study. So he was a student at the University of Florence. He graduated in philosophy and started working at the beginning as a teacher in high schools. And this at the time, certainly in Italy, but possibly also in other countries, was the starting point for an academic career. So first of all, you would start teaching in high schools, and then at the same time, you would start also making some experience, usually with some lecturing also in the university, until the moment where, if you were lucky, you could also get a position at the university itself. So as I said, Rossi was close to Reghini, to Evola. He became involved in these esoteric circles, and he even published an article. That's the only article, as far as I know, that was published in an esoteric journal. So that's Atanor, which was an esoteric journal that was created by Reghini, founded by Reghini. And Rossi contributed an article to this journal. This was in 1924. So he was still quite young. And you can see also that he was also in the editorial committee. So in the redazione, you can see also his name. So he had been invited to join even the editorial committee. In 1929, he obtains the license to teach at the university level. So there was a kind of step that you had to take that was called the libera docenza in Italy. And so this is when he begins to lecture also in a university context, especially on theoretical philosophy. So that's really his field at the beginning. And then at some point he starts traveling. So he goes also to Germany as a visiting lecturer. He spends some time in Tübingen, then in Leipzig. And then starting from 1932 in Ireland. He is invited to Ireland because he had started already to work on English philosophy or English-speaking philosophy. And for instance, he had published a few works on Berkeley. And because of that, he was actually invited to spend some time in Ireland and to do some research there. So he started to build up actually a reputation as a specialist in that area. Now, what is interesting is that it is during one of these trips to Ireland that he meets with William Butler Yeats, the Irish poet. And there is a kind of friendship that comes out of this encounter. And you can see that it's not just a one-way friendship. So Rossi certainly was, especially at the beginning, in a kind of awe in the presence of Yeats, who was already relatively, advanced age at that moment. So it was a kind of younger person in the presence of someone who was already a Nobel Prize, actually, at the time, and a senator of his own country. But it's clear that Yeats was also intrigued by Rossi. So there are letters that they exchange, and you can see that Yeats is really engaging with Rossi. He's interested in Rossi's researches and interests and so on. Now, a few things about Rossi's political position, because we saw that he was close enough to these esoteric figures who were certainly close enough in different ways, but certainly close enough to fascism, not necessarily to fascism as a regime, but certainly as an idea or as an ideology. That doesn't seem to be the case so much for Rossi, who actually built up a kind of position as an anti-fascist. He resisted taking the membership card, so he never wanted to join the fascist party, which was actually a very strong choice in the sense that at the time, if you didn't have the card, if you were not a member of the fascist party, you could actually not make an academic career. So that was really something that discriminated between those who had and those who didn't have the card. For a long time, it was thought, and this is something that you find still in studies on Rossi even today, it was thought that actually he never, ever got the card, but that's actually not true. Recently, some evidence has come up that in 1939, so late enough, but still, it is important to mention that eventually he decided to get the card because he realized that without that, he couldn't go basically anywhere. And so finally, he made that choice. But it's interesting to see that after the war, he denied that. He said that he didn't. Was this exceptional? No. Actually, you have plenty of cases of Italian intellectuals who not only took the card in order to make, a career or professional advance, but who were actually even actively involved in fascist institutions, even publishing for fascist journals. And after the war, they deleted all the traces of that, and then in some cases even joined the Communist Party, and they wanted to present themselves as absolutely with a spick and span record. So it's important to contextualize this and to be aware also of those aspects. And essentially, I would say that if you wanted to describe him, he was a liberal. He was never a radical left-wing liberal. On the contrary, and in fact, after the war, he develops quite a critique of Marxism and socialism. And I have to say, this is probably also another reason why he wasn't able to make any further career in Italy, because after the Second World War, certainly in academic milieux, in the academic context, there was certainly a predominance of left-wing and even communist scholars. So presenting yourself with that kind of critique was not necessarily the best way to make friends in that context. Okay, so let's move on and let's say something about the work that I wanted to discuss. So the Spaccio dei Maghi, that's the title of the work. And I wanted to say something first about the title. Spaccio dei maghi. Maghi is easy. In Italian, that means magician. But what is the spaccio? And some of you who have some kind of philosophical study on their shoulders might think immediately of a classic of philosophy, which is a famous work by Giordano Bruno, Lo Spaccio della Bestia Trionfante, which is usually translated into English as The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast. That was published in 1584. So what is the spaccio? What is the spaccio? It's interesting that, by the way, the same work was published in a new edition in 1928. So that was a modern edition of this Giordano Bruno work that was published right before the publication of Rossi's Spaccio dei Maghi, which was published in 1929. This was published by Carabba, who was a publisher specializing in spirituality and sometimes even esotericism. And the foreword is by Papini, precisely one of the cultural agitators that I mentioned earlier. So certainly this work by Bruno was in the air at the time, so there was a new attention generally also on Giordano Bruno as an author. But spaccio is expulsion, but I think it can also be related to an English word, which is actually etymologically close enough to spaccio, which is dispatch. So the idea of dispatching, of dismissing, disposing of. So basically what Rossi wanted to do with this work was dispatching the magicians. There is another possible source for this idea of dispatching something, and it is this interesting book that was published even earlier than the new modern edition of Bruno's book, 1925, Lo Spaccio del Bestione Trionfante. So this was a very polemical work published by Adriano Tilger, who was also a very important figure of the Italian cultural landscape at the time, a philosopher who had been close enough to theosophical milieux, so also very interested in esotericism. A kind of forgotten figure as well. So another case that it would be interesting to study with respect to philosophy, esotericism relationship. And what was the Lo Spaccio del Bestione Trionfante? Obviously, the title was also inspired by Giordano Bruno. It was actually, the Bestione was, the big brute was Giovanni Gentile. So it was actually an extremely polemical work against Gentile, because Tilger was a strong and very vocal anti-fascist intellectual. He even signed the manifesto of the anti-fascist intellectuals in 1925 as well. And so at some point he decided to write this very polemical work against the foremost, the most important fascist philosophers at the time. So the institutional philosopher at the time, which was Giovanni Gentile. So certainly, all this might be interesting precedents for Rossi's work. Also, this idea of dispatching, of disposing of particular authors or particular philosophers. Now, in any case, the meaning is clear. So what do you want to dispatch? What was the idea behind the book by Rossi? Well, the book is about, it's certainly a critique. It's a very critical book. It's also a polemical book in a certain sense. And it is coming from someone who has frequented these esoteric milieus, so who has been involved in these circles, in these milieus, has been friends with some of the people who were part of these milieus, certainly with Reghini in particular. But also of others. And at some point comes to the conclusion that he wants to move on. So he realizes that the kind of things he has done or he has experienced or he has seen are not really interesting anymore. So he wants to dismiss those experiences, those milieus themselves, and wants to develop a full-blown critique of this. So this is the cover of the book. And this is how Rossi explains his motivation and his intention. So he says, I take my leave. I'm too old to try anymore. I saw and I didn't believe. I had ears, but I did not hear. This is my farewell to occultism. Brutally, I would say that I no longer have time to waste on it. And here is the interesting twist, but I feel sorry. And this is something that we will find again. So it almost seems like he wants to close that chapter, but there is a kind of afterthought that seems always to be there. And that there is a kind of emotional component, which maybe also has to do with the personal relations that he had with some of the people he's going to talk about. Now, in the book, Rossi sees the contemporary fashion of occultism and spiritualism as directly related to the emergence of modern science in the 17th century, so the scientific revolution, and to the culture of enlightenment in the 18th century. Interestingly enough, he doesn't use the word, but it seems to imply that what happened during the scientific revolution and then during the period of the Enlightenment was the creation of a reservoir of rejected knowledge. So this is a concept that most of us are familiar with because it's something that that McGrath, contemporary scholar of esotericism, has used, as presented. But let's not forget that even before McGrath, there was another scholar using this concept. And in fact, this is where McGrath picked it up from. And this was James Webb, with a number of works in the 1970s already. Now, according to Rossi, this modern mixture of the experimentalism of modern science and of spiritual or occult interests is exemplified by Swedenborg. So this is where the analysis starts from, with Swedenborg. Swedenborg paves the ground for the later emergence of spiritualism, occultism, and theosophy. It all comes from there. So this new science, or this modern science, had discarded an infinity of aspects and forms that were still accepted in the already modern, but still encyclopedic and chaotic thought of the Renaissance. The new science necessarily brings in all fields the need for experimentation. And by organizing and ordering itself, it excludes from its midst many doctrines, many researches that Renaissance thought still admitted. We thus have, on the one hand, a certain amount of material eliminated from scientific investigation. We thus have, on the one hand, a certain amount of material eliminated from scientific investigations, and on the other hand, the need to experience and order this waste material, so the term is interesting, by those who, not being able to renounce occultist interests, tried to give them an appearance and an order, in keeping with 17th century experimentalism and the rationalist systematization of Cartesianism. Now, in the book, Rossi dispenses vitriolic critique on various esoteric personalities and movements. So after Swedenborg, there is quite something about spiritualism, theosophy, both in its Blavatskian and Byzantine variants, and also Steiner's anthroposophy. But of course, he doesn't spare the Italian occultists, so including also his friends Regini and Evola. What is interesting is that Rossi's critique is quite elaborate and sophisticated. For instance, when he discusses the vision of the world underlying modern magic, he emphasizes the process of psychologization. He doesn't use the actual term, but it's clear that this is what he is referring to. And this is something that has been noted by current scholars of esotericism. So this idea of psychologization of magic. I also agree with Magee when he underlines Rossi's insistence on the contrast between the social aspect of magic, embodied in initiatory organizations and the performance of collective rituals, and the radical individualism that seems to be unavoidable in the practice of magic. So there is a kind of rapport between the members of a magical group that seems to contradict the aspiration towards individual divinization. Now, it seems to me, and this is something that Bacci perhaps is not really focusing on, that there is also a political subtext to this critique, in the sense that the same kind of tension or contrast could be seen between those occultists, such as Evola, for instance, who had an appreciation for organic models of society, which could find a modern expression in totalitarianism, totalitarian systems, and at the same time, a radical anarchist or ultra-individualist when it came to their own personal posture. So to sum up, there is a critique of the pretension to create a spiritual science, which, according to Rossi, is doomed to fail, because it is based on experiences that, having a mystical or magical character, share a degree of ineffability. So they are not communicable, cannot be shared with others, and therefore cannot be used to build a real science. Okay, I stop here. There would be a lot more to say about the book, but I want to move on also because there is not so much time left. What happens after the publication of this book? So the book is a farewell to occultism, to esotericism, and Rossi really meant it, in the sense that after that, there doesn't seem to be really an interest in esotericism again, at least for quite a while. So he meets, for instance, with William Butler Yeats. You would expect, knowing Yeats, who was really transparent about his interests, published a lot also about his experiences and so on, you would expect that they would meet and they would talk about these things. Well, that's not the case. You don't find any trace, for instance, in the letters that they exchange. Rossi talks about meeting. Yeats says something about their conversations. Nothing about occultism, about magic, nothing. And then there is also a very interesting element. So here is Yeats, and also a book that Rossi publishes about his travels to Ireland and his meeting with Yeats. No references to occultism. There is another very interesting example. Right after the Second World War, Rossi publishes a massive work on Herbert of Cherbury, who is a kind of proto-deist, kind of forerunner pioneer of deism. And this is actually now a kind of classic, published in 3 volumes. I think it's 1,500 pages, which is a monument of erudition in itself. It covers basically every aspect of Cherbury, very detailed biography with all sorts of details. He went to look for all manuscripts around the British Isles. Well, current scholars, contemporary scholars, have noticed that in Herbert of Cherbury, there are quite a lot of elements in his thought that are coming from what we might define, simplifying, the Hermetic tradition. So by reading, for instance, Giordano Bruno, by reading, even the Corpus Hermeticum itself, well, in 3 volumes of Herbert of Cherbury by Rossi, there is nothing. So that scholars today are puzzled by this, because it's not possible that he wouldn't have noticed, especially with his knowledge also of esoteric sources. He had written a whole book on Campanella, for instance, in the 1920s. It is impossible that he wouldn't have noticed. So it's almost as if he censored himself when he saw these sources. And that's also an indication that basically he just wanted to shut the door to those elements. Well, I'm going to skip this. This is a picture of an older Rossi. And I'm going to say something about the final years of Rossi, because after many years of complete neglect and oblivion of esotericism, in his very final work, he comes back to it. He comes back to it with the publication of the Italian translation of a book which is actually a treatise by a Presbyterian minister who lived in the second half of the 17th century, Robert Kirk, who wrote this treatise, which he didn't publish. It was published posthumously, which was titled The Secret Commonwealth. And it's a whole book about the secret world of fairies. Fairies and all these entities that live in nature according to Celtic folklore. Now, Rossi decided to translate the work and to publish it with a very, very long essay. Actually, the essay is longer than the treatise by Kirk itself. So the essay is about Kirk's life and ideas. Now, the interesting thing is that in this essay, Rossi rather seems to have second thoughts about esotericism. So he writes, the new conception of the history of philosophy and of modern culture in general that I have developed in this quarter of a century, an old age that has made me less harsh and intransigent, revealing to me the emptiness of that faith in progress that I also had in my inexperienced youth. So basically the idea is that he has sort of reconsidered his position, and maybe now he is more open to the idea that there is, after all, something interesting in these ideas. So in the essay, and I really simplify and summarize, Rossi defends the idea that even contemporary science is compatible with the supernatural and with the occult. So considering that empirical applied science very often cannot justify or rationalize the procedures through which new discoveries are made, some more modesty would be in order. So there is a call for science to be a little bit less arrogant and a little bit more modest. So even a rational person, what is this? That's the fairies speaking. So according to Rossi, even a rational person cannot exclude a priori that new facts will emerge that are going to upset what we believe to be a coherent system of natural laws. And that's what we would call a paradigm, a term that Rossi doesn't use, but it's interesting to note that Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions was originally published in 1962. And this Italian translation with the essay was published in 1964. So there is a kind of zeitgeist, a little bit of air de famille, perhaps there. So we can find plenty of examples of this lack of possibility of rationalizing scientific discoveries in the history of science. Empirical science cannot prove scientifically that the supernatural and the occult don't exist. That's what Rossi claims. In the end, paradoxically, and I quote, it is the fairies who reveal the inconsistency of empirical science, end of quote. Does this mean that Rossi is willing to move himself towards a belief in the supernatural? Well, interestingly enough, this is not the conclusion of the essay. He opens the door and then he seems to shut it immediately. In fact, the conclusion of the essay, he says, has revealed to him, and I quote, the warm, pious humanity of its author. But it has certainly not persuaded me to believe in fairies. But then, right after that, and these are the very last words of the essay, there is an echo of the same regret he had expressed already in the Spaccio dei Maghi. So the final words are, and I feel sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And first of all, I'd like to thank you, Olli, the organization of the volume and also the conference. When I've seen on the Philos list the call for papers sent by Olli, I was very happy because I thought there is a platform where I can express my sadness regarding recent tendencies in philosophy. And as far as I see it in some presentations, I think I thought it rightly. I mean, so in my presentation, I would like to define something because as it became quite clear that terminology is very ambiguous in esoteric studies, or so if we would like to define what esotericism or esoteric or philosophy is, we are in trouble in a certain sense. I will attempt to define it in a certain sense, and against this background, I would like to keep to perspective or to aspects which I think is very important in philosophy as well. This is the ineffable character of truth, or the really important insights as it emerged in Bergson's and Heidegger's ideas, and the unavoidable character of transcendence as it is clearly visible in many cases. I will refer to Heidegger, Bergson, and also some remarks of Wittgenstein, and also the Gödelian incompleteness theory. And I think, in conclusion, I will suggest that these two aspects are closely related to each other. So there is a coherence between the two. So some preliminaries. I think I do not have to talk too much about what esoteric means, a Greek term belonging to an inner circle. More recently, some esoteric knowledge can be considered as something what requires a special kind of acquaintance with some volume or knowledge of something which is not quite obvious for the wider audience. We talk usually about different esoteric trends, and I will refer to esotericism as a cultural historical phenomenon, as differentiated between, in accordance with the time scale McGrath, as a pre-Enlightenment worldview with ancient roots. And these ancient roots I will refer to as Hermetism. When I first met Corpus Hermeticum, it was a great help in my understanding of some Heidegger's ideas. I think Heidegger's really mysterious vocabulary or terminology, and I think also some ideas of Plato or Parmenides can be much more understood against the background of these texts. However, these texts are, I think, it's not really clearly identifiable because their roots are in shade. I mean, it's not quite clear who was Hermes Trismegistus, whether he was taught himself as Manetho, as a letter assigned to Manetho, a priest, BC 3rd century, an Egyptian priest, who suggested that it was Hermes. Hermes was taught who wrote the sacred text in hieroglyphs. I would like to mention that hieroglyphic writing has a very special character, which needs a plasticity of interpretation and understanding in a certain way, which is really hardly conceivable for ourselves who are accustomed to the execution of alphabetical writing system, which is quite clear, because a hieroglyph can be a picture, a phoneme, and can signify a concept. So it depends on the context. It depends on my interest, how to understand scripture on the walls. And of course, what role a hieroglyph can play in a context on the wall is also plays an important role. So it's not quite clear how to understand hieroglyphic scriptures. And the second Hermes was the father of thought, a participant of the dialogue in Corpus Hermeticum. and the son of Agathon, who also related to some divine divine reason, if I may say such funny thing. And so this second Hermes was who translated the sacred text into Greek after the flood. The mentioning of the flood was something that has some I think some echo in Christian literature, or in medieval and early modern philosophical writing. So in these times, Corpus Hermeticum and Asclepius was the two dominant source of Hermetism, or this was the two corpuses via Hermes Trismegistus' heritage was approachable. Later in the 20th century, Nag Hammadi papyri was discovered. I think it was very important, clarifying certain terminological issues. I will focus on philosophical or theoretical relevance of these texts. I will avoid the practical, occult things. So in the first part of the Corpus Hermeticum, there is a philosophical investigation, if you like. So, and there plays gnosis a very important role. And gnosis has a special hint in its meaning, because however we usually translate it as knowledge or understanding, but it is not a propositional knowledge. So it's knowledge by immediate acquaintance. So it's hardly expressible in terms of rationality or reasoning. It's a kind of salvific knowledge, what makes possible the soul's liberation from its material entanglements and make possible to unite with the divine mind. Interestingly, according to Hermes Trismegistus' heritage, it is possible in life. So it's not exclusively afterlife, as Christian theology suggests, but during a human lifetime, it is also accessible. And also for gaining or having gnosis in an appropriate form, we need some connection with nous. Nous also is, I think, not quite clear or easily definable concept, because it means universal awareness on the one hand and the ultimate reality on the other hand. And this seemingly funny definition, as on the one hand it has some epistemic or epistemological relevance, on the other hand it has an ontological one, but it can suggest that its wholeness as a unity is necessary for being able to comprehend it as it is. So the activity, the understanding of it and seeing the truth as it is possible only when we are in this kind of wholeness. I think in some so we can face such things in the history of philosophy as well. I think there are important turning points. I would not go into details, but I think I have to mention Ficino's translation, who translated gnosis to cognition. And it has a distortive potential, if I may say. The reconsideration of the term was thanks to the discovery of the Nag Hammadi papyri. However, his contemporary Lazzarelli translated this term much more closer to its original meaning. And after a couple of centuries or years, McGrath mentioned the name of Jacob Brucker, who really made an important distinction between philosophy through religion and the so-called pagan religion. Philosophy, and I will use esotericism in the last sense. I mean, philosophy is dedicated to reason, and true religion is responsible for revelation or revelative knowledge, and pagan religion as a kind of integrated fusion of reason and revelation. So I would use this lecture, at least, esoteric as something where reason and revelation belongs together. They are not separated as strictly as Brooker suggested. We will see that in the history of philosophy, a kind of synchronicity with Kant's suggestion how was this divine transcendence or this revelative knowledge was eliminated from the realm of philosophy. So the first aspect, the ineffable character of truth. There are three, I think, interrelated concepts as we see in gnosis and nous. I do not want to recapitulate what I've said already. And logos is the third very important instance in this sense. And at this point, we'll see why I start with Heidegger, not with Bergson in reversed order. So a logos in Hermeticism says that it is a mediator between human consciousness and the divine. It is capable of provide us some insight, the polarities between matter and nous. It is capable of mediating between them on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is capable for mediating between the humans. So it makes possible mediating a revelatory knowledge for people, for humans as well, not just communication between the divine and the human. And as it is expressed quite explicitly in the Corpus Hermeticum, reason, the discourse, as not capable lead us so far as the truth, as logos other way would be capable of doing so. So, however, the first part of Corpus Hermeticum is a kind of reason discourse, so it's kind of philosophical argumentation. Beside the importance on emphasizing the relation towards the divine transcendence, it is not capable of providing the excess so clearly as it would be possible otherwise. So this suggests that logos as a communicative means is not capable, or language, I may say, is not capable of this kind of information transmitter. And this idea emerges in Heidegger's philosophy quite explicitly, as early as in the Being and Time. Also, already in Being and Time, he suggests that logos has a kind of revealing potential significant for human beings. I will not go into details, but I will say a little bit more about it. And there is another very important term, aletheia, which is important when our concern is being, because the concealed and unconcealed are characters of the very being itself and not characteristic of the noticing and apprehending activity. Nevertheless, perceiving and saying have indeed for Greeks too the basic feature of truth and untruth. So it's very important to emphasize again that after the invention of alphabetical writing, a certain conceptual change emerged in ancient Greek philosophy. And these overlaps and these belongingness of saying and the thing itself evaded, as we will see in case of Bergson, who quite explicitly describes why language is incapable of providing us with truth. Suggests, so aletheia is what shows us being as a kind of concealment and unconcealment, and it is present everywhere, but not for the grasping mind, not for the reasoning cognition as it is used to understood in recent discourses. However, logos is discourse, suggests Heidegger. In Being and Time, we can read that the logos lets something be seen, namely what the discourse is about. The discourse lets something be seen, that is, it lets us see something from the very thing which the discourse is about. But at the same time, logos as discourse became the primary locus of truth. These characteristics suggest a referential relation. I think everyone who's acquainted with some kind of epistemology or philosophy of mind or linguistics reference to something and as a truth condition. And in Heidegger's view, representational relation is a very distorting one. It suggests an alienated relation towards our surrounding, our environment. And it suggests that things are not ready at hand instruments, ready to use them, but rather something which are against us, standing over against us. In a later writing in the Letter of Humanism, he wrote, "Language is the house of being, in its home and dwells. Those who think and those who create with words are the guardians of this home." I would emphasize this because this quotation suggests, and other writings as well, that poets and philosophers has a distinguished role in this process, because a philosophy is to show the work of aletheia in its entirety. That is, philosophy is capable of showing, or should be capable of showing, concealment and unconcealment at the same time, that is, capturing the whole, while poetry is to give a name to being in its positivity as a wholly, if you like, and highlights unconcealment. And I would like to refer back to, again, to hieroglyphic writing as a pictorial writing as compared to the alphabetical writing, which define things according to the acoustic phenomenon. So poetry is capable of doing so because poetry speaks in images. We will return to images or image-like phenomena in language in case of Bergson. So just to recapitulate what I already said, in a hermetic context, logos makes the material world coherent. So it provides a background against which things have some meaning, things have some so it provides some understanding how to be amongst material things, and makes it possible to share knowledge about the divine. Heidegger understood logos as it has constitutive power, make things visible, distinguishable, and since it is expressed via language, we can share it. But unfortunately, we use language as if it were a mere instrument without the power of showing and constitution. So when we use language as if it would be a thing around us, as a table or as a chair, and we sometimes use it as an instrument, as a mere instrument, without this constitutive power which logos was attributed to, but provided. We forget about it, and we use language in an appropriate way, but does not make possible transmitting the truth. So in this sense, and in the Heideggerian context, language is incapable of providing or making accessible the truth via language. This is the reason. So Bergson, we've heard a nice lecture about Bergson. I would like just to mention the background against which I think is a recapitulation how language behaves or how language is constituted by language. He suggests that, similarly to Heidegger, however, that metaphysics, a random way, started with Zeno of Elea. His famous paradox of Achilles and the Tortoise suggests a very, very misunderstood relation to movement. Because our primordial nature, or the nature of our spirit, is not in accordance with spatial relations, as this paradox suggests, as a transgression from one state of rigid things towards the other one. Rather, it's a kind of flux. But we necessarily express ourselves by means of words, and usually think in terms of space. As Bergson suggests, that is, language is tailored in accordance with space. So humans, as not exclusively spiritual, but material beings, have language as an instrument for the intellect to be able to survive in the world of material things, and in accordance with being able to handle things, material things, our language is tailored in accordance. So with this framework. So, but the basic conflict is that the truth is that there is neither a rigid, immovable substratum nor distinct states passing over it like actors on the stage. There is simply the continuous melody of our inner life, a melody which is going on and will go on, indivisible from the beginning to the end of our conscious existence. It can remind us, James was mentioned, I think, yesterday and today as well. So we can have in mind his stream of consciousness, a very similar idea. The flow of experiences, stream of consciousness suggests, I think, the same zeitgeist seems to work again nicely. And his description of language has two, according to his description of language, suggests two really important characteristics of language. One is abstraction, and abstraction distorts in two different ways. One is solidifying a certain percept. So we have different impressions, we have perceptions, and when we name it, we solidify it in a certain way. And this solidity of this concept, when I say for something in my mouth as a taste, it suggests that this is a rigid, well-definable thing-like phenomenon. However, it is not, because it's in continuous change. It is not possible. So we don't get what we want to have if we solidify it, because it is not possible. It's a process. It's a flow. And abstracting also suggests something that certain aspects or qualities, when we abstract certain abstract qualities, may suggest confusing the object's property with being a part of it, what also is a misunderstanding of the situation, and it results in the illusion that when we describe something by listing established qualities, we are inclined to believe that we receive an equivalent of the object. And generalization is the other distortive characteristics of language, because the concept can symbolize a particular property only by making it common to an infinity of things. But therefore, it always more or less distorts this property by the extension it gives to it. That is, when we apply a kind of abstraction, we distort it in a certain sense. So when we have an impression of a taste, we give it a name, sweet, for instance, and we use this word in different sweetness, in case of different sweetness when we feel it. And it's never the exact impression, it's never the exact conscious perception we had. So, but Bergson is optimistic in a certain sense, because beside intellect, we have intuition, as he suggests. And intuition in his consideration is a direct access to our consciousness. So our intuition makes possible a direct access to our conscious stream, the stream of our consciousness. It is a kind of direct insight. And it can find expression through analogies and metaphors, which lead us again back towards to image-like things, not that definite as words. But unfortunately, we should add these metaphors can crystallize into terminology, and we are exactly at the same point when it started. But we're trying it all the time, and I think the history of philosophy can be seen from this perspective, providing a better framework or a better perspective and a better vocabulary, expressing the ineffable truth. So, and the unavoidable transcendental. We see what news, news played in regarding gnosis or this revelative knowledge, and in this sense, I think Professor McGrath mentioned yesterday that he suggests that everything is empirical. I would prefer the expression of experiential, because this revelative knowledge is accessible via private or individual experience. So that's why verbal expression or linguistic expression is not capable of providing it, as Bergson, I think, very nicely show us how it is impossible to describe something as it is. This individual or personal experience, be it relative or any other kind, is not accessible linguistically and not communicable. And in Heidegger's case, the interplay between concealment and unconcealment as the basic characteristics of being and intuition, through which Diržys, the stream of consciousness in Jamesian terms, is accessible in case of Bergson, are all beyond mundane experience. So they are all beyond the material world. They are all beyond our worldly experiences, merely worldly experiences. So when we reflect upon our psychic life or conscious states or the way how we're cognizing, how we make a decision or whatever, it's a different level, but the mundane experience is below this limit, and all these instances I've been talking about are beyond these mundane experience. So there is an effort, an additional effort, and we would like to talk about these things. However, meaning and coherence of worldly experiences can emerge against the background of these instances. So in both cases, there is something beyond we refer to when we would like to describe the complete phenomena of our worldly experiences. So Heidegger describes the process of the oblivion of being as it is happened. According to him, he suggests it happened quite early when our attention from being itself was turned toward the final ground of beings. It's important that being as a kind of transcendence, if you like, and beings as things and entities in our world. So this was the arche. I think the divine transcendence was not in question in medieval times. It was included in argumentation. So it was beyond question, and it was beyond question even for Descartes, its existence and omnipotence. But with his cogito, with his suggestion that we have to establish our knowledge about the world within ourselves, within the individual mind, resulted in eliminating the divine transcendence from the field of epistemology. And I think it is a decisive step. The next decisive step is taken by Kant. He wrote in his paper, Reflection on Swedenborg's ideas, that metaphysics is the science of the boundaries of human reason. That is, he excludes transcendence from the realm of metaphysics, because the eligibility of things via the human reason is what our target is. So the transcendental is beyond, because it is not possible to get it within human understanding. If we keep in mind that I think it has happened. Kant's writing appeared 25 years or so earlier than Brooker's suggestion that eliminating the unificatory efforts in esoteric thinking, the knowledge and reason and relevance, revelatory knowledge, is very interesting, because from now on, I think transcendence plays a very, very interesting and curious role in the history of philosophy, as we can see in Heidegger's case. So in his early writing, he talks about immanent transcendence, and it can remind us to intentionality as being intentionally. So when we are getting acquainted with things, we are towards something outside ourselves. It's a very interesting, however, reaching back to the scholastic. So it's an interesting paradox, if you like. But I think in later writings, Heidegger thinks that regarding transcendence, in later Heidegger emerged the divine transcendence in the form of being. Because in case of Heidegger, being and Dasein, human being who is thrown into the world, and Dasein is a distinguished being because he is capable of reflecting upon its thrownness and its relation to being. The Dasein is only exclusively capable of grasping the situation that without being, there is nothing. I mean, being is a necessary condition for having what we have in mind and being a worldly existence. So being itself, however, belongs to us, for only with us can being be present as being, that is, become present. So in this sense, Dasein has had an important and distinguished role as it relates to transcendence. And in Bergson's case, I think transcendence is quite clear that spirit entails transcendence, but we can think that spirit entails transcendence in the technical sense that it is sharply distinguished from the material world. But here again, the inquiry into the relationship between body and mind is solely a concern for the spirit. Just as in the case of Heidegger, Dasein is capable of relating itself towards transcendence and relating spirit and matter as the two poles of the metaphysics. It is only for the spirit important having this relation. Yes, today we heard that not exclusively mind is embodied in Bergsonian terms, but also matter is spiritualized in a certain sense. It is really nicely described in Matter and Memory, really granular and gradual process, and it is with the help of a kind of representation in using the time element, so past, future, how these are intertwined together, how they relate. So I think it's a masterpiece in a certain sense. And I think there is some hints also, a kind of spirituality, I think, which is, in my terms, beyond simple, not simple, because reasoning is not so simple, but this rational reasoning. And finally, just a few words about the incompleteness. I would refer first mainly to Gödel's second incompleteness theorem, and how he suggests that this just formal system, so to the realm of natural numbers, I think we can extend it, and I will try to show how it is possible with the help of some concerns of Wittgenstein. So this states that the system cannot be established on its own consistency. So a system cannot establish its own consistency. So it is not possible to ground the system within itself. Plainly, I think there was a reference to the last sentence of Tractatus, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And the chain of thought, I tried to reconstruct, I will not do it because time is almost over. So Wittgenstein suggests that language is capable of describing atomic facts, but these atomic facts are satisfying only for sciences or in a mundane world. So it's not enough when we would like to reflect upon the problems of life. Because the problems of life are not sufficiently explicable in language because they are beyond the scope of logic and scientific analysis. So as we have seen in case of logos as reason discourse in Hermetic tradition, as we've seen logos as a mere instrument for communication in case of Heidegger, and abstraction and generalization as what makes a language strongly distortive or incapable of being exact and accurate enough, as Bergson described it. These makes language incapable of providing us with answers to the questions of life. So taking into account our limits, Heidegger had a lot of, I think, good insights. He illuminated how mental processes and the expression of these mental processes, how they relate to each other. I will refer to James again, who suggests that we duplicate our reality in a certain sense when we say at the same thing once at mental phenomena and at the other time of something this mental phenomena referred to. And also calls attention that when we express our ideas or feelings or pains or whatever, we express it within a calculus, within a linguistic system. And that is, we transform it in accordance with this linguistic system, which I think induces some change as well. And language is connected with reality by picturing it, but that connection cannot be made in language, because if we would like to describe this connection, we need a meta-language. And if we would get a coherent and complete picture of the whole process, we need the meta-language and the meta-language of a meta. So it's all infinite regress, we conclude to this. Right. So summarizing the ideas I referred to by Wittgenstein, when we want to understand mental phenomena or the operation of language as worldly occurrences, we need to reach beyond it. We have to transcend its limits, otherwise we find ourselves in finite regress. That is, if we limit the framework of philosophy to a mundane world, to the world of understanding, as science does. So when consciousness studies start to investigate how can they define consciousness, they really set very rigid limitations of their inquiries. And if we do the same in case of philosophy, I think as philosophy used to ask about the whole, the answer to give such questions targeting at the whole will not be possible. So as a conclusion, introducing new terminology of perspective, demonstrating insufficiency of earlier reconstructions and the need for a new framework. It's an old idea that the history of philosophy is footnotes to Plato. That is, we try all the time reformulate old problems in accordance with recent occurrences. and the ineffable character of the ultimate truth or reality or experiential world in uses claiming to transcend the ordinary mundane domain of experience. I think it's clearly visible when people or philosophers I refer to suggest new perspectives, new entry points, and new terminology. And although recent philosophy articulates itself in new terms and mostly targets mundane phenomena, its relationship to transcendence in its literary sense and the effort to express itself appropriately are as crucial as in the case of esotericism. So even if metaphysics has been stripped from its access to transcendence, it was made by Kant, this kind of need of transcendence is present, even in technical terms. But as vital questions remain unsolved, they are pushed forward and reformulated. The relation between the ineffable and the transcendent suggests, I think, a welcome return of transcendence to the field of philosophy, even in the divine sense. Thank you very much.
Before I start, I want to thank Olli for organizing such an interesting conference, for bringing everybody together to discuss these ideas. I've very much enjoyed the presentation so far, and it's a real privilege to be here. So my topic is on the confluence of Kabbalah and Romanticism. I'm sure most people here are at least partially familiar with Kabbalah. It's the dominant form of Jewish mysticism. The dominant form of Jewish mysticism that developed out of the Merkabah tradition and became a discrete form of esotericism in medieval Judaism. It's still most prevalent today in its Lurianic form. Romanticism is perhaps a bit less clear. I will be focusing on what is sometimes called philosophical Romanticism or early German Romanticism. So this is the school of thought that arose in the city of Jena at the turn of the 19th century and has since been incredibly influential in philosophy. So the effect of early German Romanticism is palpable in Hegel, in the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, in post-structuralism, and so on. I'm specifically focusing on the work of Johann Hamann, who is a very important predecessor of Romanticism, along with two central members of the Jena Circle, Friedrich Schlegel and Novalis. What interests me about this connection between these seemingly disparate topics is their reciprocal relation. I would argue that it's not simply philosophers mining the esoteric for conceptual forms or appropriating the discursive elements of a tradition for their own ends. I think there's much more going on in this relationship. There is an unintentional, sometimes, convergence with Kabbalah and Romanticism reaching an affinity through independent developments. There is a genuine, rather than cynical, philosophical reinterpretation of the mystical tradition. And there is a reciprocity, with Romanticism feeding back into the study of Kabbalah in the 20th century through scholars such as Walter Benjamin and Gershom Scholem. I would also like to suggest that this specific confluence hints at the prevalence of esotericism in philosophy and possibly even indicates some challenges to the rigid distinction that we have between the two categories. Rather than simply restate what I've written in my contribution to the book, which I don't really have time to get into now, I thought it would be better to explain how I arrive at the themes that I address in that chapter, give an account of some of the interesting elements that I've had to exclude, and tentatively introduce some of the conclusions that I draw there. My research engages both philosophy and theology, and my primary focus has been on Hamann and the Romantics, so that's where I'm going to start. So Hamann, for those who don't know him, is a wonderfully obscure writer. He constantly uses oblique allusions, multilingual puns, uncited quotations, extended metaphors. He uses rhetorical devices such as aposiopesis, which is where sentences are deliberately left unfinished, or anakulaton, in which incongruous ideas are expressed in the same sentence. There's a playful mix of the erudite and the enigmatic, the sacred and the profane, and these are all variously indexed to classical and biblical imagery. This results in really quite short but incredibly dense texts that are at once a sort of unwieldy chaos of ideas and yet full of concise philosophical insight. It's a veritable wellspring of interpretive possibility. One of Haman's key techniques is that of indirect communication. So that is not simply writing as himself, but adopting personas, which then color the reading of the particular text to which they're ascribed. So of particular interest now is one of Haman's more well-known essays, Aesthetica in Nuce, which means aesthetics in a nutshell. This text bears the subtitle, A Rhapsody of Kabbalistic Prose, and is attributed to the Kabbalistic philologian. To briefly gloss this title and its author, some elements seem clear enough. Rhapsody is likely to be taken in the classical Greek sense, meaning to sew or stitch together, with the ancient rhapsodists reciting and performing pieces, elements of Homer and Hesiod, for example. So this then carries a sense of the fragmentary and a diversity coming together to form a new whole, which in itself is an apt description of Haman's writing style. Further, philologian is an archaic term for philologist, and thus suggests Haman's fascination with language, which is very clear in his use of German, French, English, Latin, Hebrew, Greek, and occasionally even more. It also seems to be an implicit affirmation of Haman's Christian faith, with philologian literally being lover of the word, and Jesus being identified with the word logos in the Gospel of John. And there's obviously further esoteric consequences, as Zsuzsanna has just explained, with the connection with logos. But then what of Kabbalah? What's Kabbalah doing in the title and the authorship? Some commentators have understood Haman to connect Kabbalah with hermeneutics, founded on a sort of passing familiarity of Kabbalistic interpretations of scripture. And this would mean that Kabbalah is rendered a thematic allusion and little more. However, I think there's much more to it. In Plato's Ion, which Haman cites twice in the Aesthetica, the rhapsodists are termed interpreters of interpreters, and they are also claimed by Socrates to operate by divine inspiration. Further, with the relationality in the implicit in the use of philologian as both a lover of language and a lover of God, these elements all suggest a greater concern with distinctly Kabbalistic themes of revelation and participation in the divine. So it's this question that first prompted my research into Kabbalah under the rubric of recognizing what philosophical significance it held for Haman, and thus also for the Romantics following him. In the course of this research, I found a glut of fascinating correspondences and borrowings. And in the chapter, I mainly focused on Haman's philosophy of language, but this grew out of a broader recognition of relationality in his work. One of Haman's clearest affinities with the Kabbalah of the traditional Judaism is the theme of sexuality and its relation to the divine. So in the Jewish Kabbalah, the creativity of God is often expressed through metaphors of genitalia, especially in Zoharic literature, and that pertaining to the Sephirot, which are, I'm sure many people are aware, the 10 emanations or attributes of the divine. So, you know, the Sephirotic tree of life, this is often indexed to the human body. And so of interest here is the 9th Sephira, Yesod, which is associated with sexual organs. So the imagery of a sexual union between the divine and creation appears at several points in the Zohar, and it's laid out in really quite explicit terms in the Idra Rabbah and the Idra Zuta, which is the greater and lesser assemblies. So suffice to say that in Kabbalistic writing, sexual imagery becomes the most appropriate form of symbolizing union with the divine. So looking back at Haman's self-identification as a lover of the word, this maybe takes on a new, more literal meaning if we take the Kabbalistic element alongside it. So it's striking how similar the writings of Haman appear to these aspects of the Kabbalistic tradition, with their regular use of profane and crude imagery to speak of God, and Haman's emphasis on the theological significance of sexuality. In a 1768 letter to Herder, one of his contemporaries, Haman claims that his crude imagination has never been able to conceive of a creative spirit without genitalia. The creative spirit here is schöpferischen Geist, and thus carries the connotation of pertaining to creation at large. So that means that Haman is referring both to mankind in their creative capacity, but also to God as the supreme creator. So this idea of the divine engaged sexually in creation, as I mentioned, aligns very well with the Sephirotic account found in the Zohar. And scholar Larry Vaughan has sort of gone over quite a lot of this with reference to the work of Nachmanides, a medieval Kabbalist, and also Christian von Rosenholz's translation of the Zohar. In his essay, Vaughan has drawn several parallels between the Kabbalistic themes of revelation as an unveiling of the nakedness of God, with the same theme apparent in Haman. For example, Haman again writes to Herder, "I feel the same way as you do about the Sephirot. It is nevertheless always striking that our first realization of good and evil referred to the pudenda. Revelation for Haman has always been associated with nakedness, and it's thought of as an encounter for which sexual language is the most fitting." The sexual language is sort of a simultaneous concealing in that it encodes it in the text, but then also a revealing in that it is, it's crude, right? It just sort of reveals the sort of normally hidden aspects of divinity. And Haman is very clearly aware of these dynamics as well. So one of his later essays is literally called Disrobing and Transfiguration. It is this sensitivity to the relational in Haman that carries on into his philosophy of language and demonstrates a more than passing affinity with the Kabbalistic tradition. In his Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, Gershom Scholem explains, and I quote, "The Kabbalists deduce from Genesis 4, verse 1, and Adam knew Eve, his wife, that knowing always means realizing a union, be it the union of Sophia, Chochmah, and the intelligence, Bina, in the upper Sephirot, be it that of the king and the Shekinah as the symbol of the eternal feminine in the lower ones. Knowledge has always received a sublime erotic note, a point that is often emphasized in Kabbalistic writings," end quote. So in Kabbalah, epistemology itself has a sexual aspect in that it is the meeting point of distinct elements, and it is by their union alone that knowledge is possible. As Scholem explains, there are various interpretations within the tradition of Kabbalah as to what the elements of this union are. But interestingly, Haman articulates an idea exactly in line with this notion. This is one of the areas where I don't think Haman is drawing necessarily distinctly from the Kabbalistic tradition. I think instead they are both starting from the same place, and that is the Hebrew word yada, which means both to know and to know sexually. So this play on words is sort of not surprising given how focused both Haman and the Kabbalists are on the language of scripture. This works in both directions for Haman, in that cognition is sexual in nature, but at the same time, sexual relations and marriage are themselves the locus of divine revelation. So the enthusiasm of the inspired rhapsodist that he refers to in his title can be understood as a distinctly relational approach to language, a bringing together of difference into unity. Such embodied experience comes under the domain of the aesthetic for Haman, and his emphasis on the theological and philosophical importance of such experience brings him remarkably close to the Kabbalistic tradition, both through a line of textual influence that I think is there but is quite hard to trace, but also by developing a comparable interpretive paradigm in his approach to scripture. And he really goes at lengths to emphasize the aesthetic element of language. So, for example, in the essay, he talks about how hieroglyphs specifically precede letters and bring this aesthetic experience of communication to the foreground in such a way that I think is really quite related to the radical empiricism that we were talking about yesterday. So the epistemological affinity becomes particularly prevalent in Haman's philosophy of language, and it's that I explore at length in the contribution to the book. So I'm not going to repeat that here, but suffice to say that it's very evident in Haman's approach to hermeneutics, particularly in his attack on historical criticism that foreclosed on the poetic and embodied aspects of biblical language, as well as his defense on the expressiveness of language. Okay, so even though I'm emphasizing him at great length, Haman is not the only source of Kabbalistic themes for Schlegel and Novalis, who follow him the generation later. One can also point to Salomon Maimon, who was actually a Kabbalist before becoming interested in Kant in the 1790s. But also the theosophical work of Jakob Böhmer is especially important for Novalis. I think it's also important to note that the Kabbalistic studies of Lutheran theologian Friedrich Oettinger were very important for the Jena circle, but this was much more of an influence on Friedrich Schelling rather than Novalis or Schlegel. And I'm not really looking at Schelling. There's been a lot written about him and his engagement with Kabbalah, so I don't think I need to say more about that. Further, the Kabbalah is not the only esoteric discourse that is taken up by the Romantics. It's really quite possible to find alchemical and hermetic themes, and Novalis expresses a particular enthusiasm for the work of Paracelsus. So that is to say that the adoption of Kabbalistic themes by the early German Romantics is quite different from the traditional Kabbalah in that it's incredibly multifaceted and syncretic. However, the reason I'm focusing on Haman is because he's the most important antecedent for the aestheticization of Kabbalah, and his relational aesthetics flow very strongly into Romanticism. Schlegel especially emphasizes the role of love, for example. And this is both epistemic. So Schlegel argues that one can only come to know nature through love, through having this relationship. But it's also theological. So one of Schlegel's fragments reads, all life in its ultimate origins, not natural, but divine and human, for it must arise out of love. Just as with Haman, this relationality is considered a coincidence of opposites that is necessary for knowledge. And this takes on a particular linguistic expression. There's a particular form of writing that seems to be appropriate for these authors to express this coincidence of opposites. So that is one that is fragmentary, full of irony, full of jokes, full of strange referential combinations. What is most important for my research is that this linguistic expression is identified as Kabbalistic by the Romantics themselves. This is a Kabbalah that is made a trope of the aesthetic, and yet, despite this aestheticization, there is a surprising continuity to be found with the traditional Kabbalah. Schlegel, following Haman's influence, sees an unending potential for interpretation in language. Haman's difficult yet playful style impels his reader to interpret what he's saying. There just isn't a plain reading. The text evades anything like a straightforward communicative function. Schlegel and Novalis adopt aspects of this method for writing, turning to the form of the fragment to produce a garland of thoughts that is strung together, embracing their incompleteness, and again, requiring the reader to interpret them as their meaning and their interrelation is simply not self-evident. In this, they can address a host of different topics with their thoughts sort of cascading around, purposefully lacking a discursively deducible organization and foregoing any kind of conjunction between the different arguments. The Romantics would work together on this, compiling collections of fragments from multiple authors without delineating the authorship. They would also comment on each other's works. So, for example, Novalis filled one of Schlegel's handwritten manuscripts with his own notes and commentary on the fragments themselves. More so than with Haman, then, one can start to see a formal similarity to things like the collections of rabbinic sayings, or the glosses upon glosses, or commentaries upon commentaries of the Talmud. Even the Zohar, though not fragmentary in the same way, is composed of an incredibly eclectic collection of texts. There's an affinity even in terms of authorship. So though the Zohar is traditionally ascribed to Shimon bar Yochai, more recent historical scholarship suggests that there may have been a circle of Kabbalists centered around the 13th century Spanish rabbi Moses de Leon, whose group authorship was combined to form the text. So the point here is that the relationality of philosophy is quite literally performed in the text. This is a relationality that begins to break down clear boundaries between the authors themselves, between the text and its interpretation. And this too implies an ongoingness. When the interpretation is contiguous with the text, it too can be interpreted. There is an essential incompleteness. So harkening back to Haman's Rhapsodist, this eagerness to emphasize the ongoingness of poetic production through perpetual interpretation is pushed by Schlegel and Novalis to distinctly Kabbalistic ends. The example I want to focus on to draw out more of this Kabbalah romantic affinity is their idea of producing an infinite book. In one of his fragments, Schlegel muses, and I quote, "It must be possible for there to be an infinite number of Bibles," end quote. This idea emerges precisely because language can be reworked and reinterpreted ad infinitum. Reading this fragment, I am put instantly in mind of the Kabbalistic interpretive technique of the Temura, which is a process which transforms the words of the Bible through an inversion or otherwise systematic substitution of letters. So when the Mishnah reads, "Turn the Torah over and over, for everything is in it," it is the Kabbalists and the Romantics that take this idea seriously, seeking to do just that by constantly reworking, recombining, and interchanging the text so as to perpetually turn it over, to render the Bible in a constant state of becoming, to use Navalis's words. The Temura is a particularly prominent form of biblical interpretation in the Kabbalah, and it's traceable to the most early Kabbalistic texts, the Sefer Yetzirah, for example, but it's also utilized in Ashkenazi Hasidim in the 12th and 13th centuries. It's used in Abraham Abulafia's ecstatic form of Kabbalah, and it's even picked up in the Renaissance Christian adoption of Kabbalah, particularly in the work of Pico della Mirandola. Navalis's claim that any discourse can be substituted for and combined with any other, I think, can be read as a higher order instantiation of these linguistic permutations. And similarly, Schlegel's insistence on infinite interpretation to the point of incomprehensibility, something that he calls a Kabbalistic frenzy, means that he is open to a radical instability of meaning. A text can mean something really quite different from what it seems to say initially. Hence, the Romantics recognize the language of Kabbalah as distinctively appropriate and therefore self-identify with the tradition. Schlegel equates aesthetics with Kabbalah, and Navalis's syncretic combinatorial philosophy is termed by Navalis Kabbalistics. The tradition of Kabbalah thus articulates the relationality that the Romantics want to demonstrate, the relation of the sign and the signified in their linguistic philosophy, the relationship between author and reader, the relationship between these different combined discourses, the text and its interpretation, even between the different fragments themselves. It's through these connections that Romanticism begins to filter through to the academic study of Kabbalah in the early 20th century, which is what I'll turn to now for the last bit. So my focus of this adoption of Romanticism back into the study of Kabbalah is the work and friendship of Gershom Scholem and Walter Benjamin. Scholem is perhaps the most well-known scholar who restored the Kabbalah as a legitimate subject for academic attention. On the other hand, Benjamin was an important interpreter of the Romantics, as well as a philosopher of art, history, and language in his own right. And he was affiliated with, although not technically a member of the Frankfurt School. Benjamin's early essay on language as such and the language of man shows Haman's influence and adopts the Romantic paradigm of understanding an essential relationship between things and their names in an originary divine language, a language of being, so to speak. This relationship is also obviously apparent in the Kabbalah, with an emphasis on God speaking the world into being, and the consequences of which are drawn out in the Sefer Yetzirah. Benjamin's essay contains further interesting Kabbalistic elements, including an interpretation of the Adamic naming in the early chapters of Genesis, and ultimately the purpose of the essay is to posit an almost mystical metaphysics of language. This is really quite consistent in Benjamin's work. So if I turn now to one of his later works, his theses on the philosophy of history, this adopts the Romantic fragmentary form directly, assuring the essay format for a series of implicitly connected aphorisms. The work seems to strongly bear the influence of the Lurianic Kabbalah in its treating the whole of history as an ongoing disaster. The doctrine of the breaking of the Sephirotic vessels lurks behind Benjamin's thought, and the restitution that he advocates in his work through a weak messianism might then be understood with reference to the Lurianic idea of tikkun, or the mystical repairing of the divine order. The text reads as a veiled yet distinctly Kabbalistic interpretation of history articulated in the language of philosophy. And yet Benjamin's Kabbalism seems far more informed by the philosophers that I've been discussing so far, rather than by the traditional Kabbalah. So, for example, his doctoral dissertation was focused on some of these elements of Schlegel and Navalis. And And Sholem even compares him to Haman in one of his later letters. So, taking this into account, the work of Benjamin is in many ways the meeting point of these two traditions. Sholem also follows in the wake of the Romantics. He was particularly enthusiastic about Novalis as a student, and early on he declares in his diary that he belongs to Romanticism. He even cites Haman approvingly as late as the 1970s in one of his later essays. At certain points, Sholem also seems to be drawn to the fragmentary form. He calls the Talmud, and I quote, a heap of ruins in which occasionally magnificent fragments can be discovered, end quote. This is to say, he regards the Talmud as something essentially incomplete or in need of restoration. Further, his essay, The 10 Historical Aphorisms on Kabbalah, demonstrate his own attempt at fragmentary writing in the vein of Schlegel. In his essay on Sholem, Michael Lurvy confirms the significance of German Romanticism for Sholem, but then also his subsequent attempt to downplay this significance. The relational aesthetics of Romanticism inform, at least in part, Sholem's engagement with the historical Kabbalah, with his adoption of their aesthetic approach to language and the constitutive incompleteness of the tradition. So, to summarize, with this, I want to argue that Romanticism feeds back into engagements with Kabbalah in an incredibly influential way, as Sholem's work is essentially the foundation for the contemporary study of the Kabbalah. Benjamin can even be understood as trying to unite the two traditions, with his work contributing to and interpreting both simultaneously. Literary critic Harold Bloom goes as far to argue that the romantic aestheticization of Kabbalah is itself a Kabbalistic move. And so the lineage that I have described should be considered as genuinely Kabbalistic in itself. So what I mean by this is that the Kabbalah of the Romantics cannot be identified with that of the traditional Jewish Kabbalah, nor its Christian appropriation, though it's related to both. And nor is it simply a tangent of the more recent Hermetic Kabbalah. Rather, it's in its own category. In the Romantic Kabbalah, then, the esoteric finds a form of unification with philosophy as giving pertinent expression to specific philosophies of language, hermeneutics, and aesthetics. This is one instance where the differentiation, I argue, begins to break down, as it's not really possible to delineate the philosophical from the esoteric in the work of Haman, Schlegel, and Novalis. Ultimately, this unification provides a framework for the thinking of linguistic relationality in the work of Sholem and Benjamin in the first half of the 20th century. And this point of convergence persists in the work of later thinkers such as Harold Bloom, Jacques Derrida, Michael Lurvy, and I think should continue to inform our conception of the division between philosophy and esotericism. I'll leave it there for now, but thank you very much for listening.
Hi guys, just let me thank Olli, everyone for attending, for inviting me, for letting me present my work. I'll be talking about Christian and Islamic esotericism. I'll be using a phenomenological approach, and I'll be specifically discussing the concepts of soul and time. I realized I won't have enough time to discuss Meister Eckhart and Ibn Arabi today. So I thought I'd just highlight Ibn Arabi's role in Islamic esotericism and highlight the connection between his understanding of the Barzakh and Edith Stein's understanding of the Avim. Okay, so the phenomenological study of esoteric experiences suggests the integration of multiple perspectives which do not create interdisciplinary constraints, but instead assist in the development of the understanding of esoteric intuition with regard to its positioning in different horizons of inquiry. Phenomenologically, according to Stein, one follows the description of some sort of phenomenon in the hope that they gain a sort of insight. For Stein, that insight is not gained through through some sort of magical vision, but instead through philosophical rigor. The primary task of a phenomenological inquiry, in this case, on the esotericism of soul and time, is not to provide a definite answer to temporal or spiritual questions, but to clarify what is being implied by them. So who is Edith Stein? Edith Stein is, well, Pope John Paul II has made a particular effort to call attention to the work and life of Edith Stein, canonizing her as Saint Theresia Benedicta Croce around, I think, in the 90s, naming her co-patroness of Europe and making explicit mention of her in his Fides et Ratio. The details of her life: well, she was born to a Jewish family, and she became an atheist, and then she became a student under Edmund Husserl, where she started working on a phenomenology of empathy, feelings, and understanding of the individual and personhood of the state. In 22, Stein was baptized into the Catholic Church and ordained as a Carmelite nun in 33. And in 42, she was murdered in Auschwitz. After her baptism, her philosophical scholarship takes on a quite different character from her early phenomenological writings. Her early work followed the descriptive phenomenological method closely and was constructed from her own observations and reflections. Her later work, on the other hand, tries to integrate Aristotelian philosophy, philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, Saint Thomas Aquinas, and of course her scholarship as a phenomenologist, her work as a phenomenologist. Stein argues that philosophy must be completed by faith in order to be true to its mission, and constructs an ontology that attempts to ascend to the full meaning of being. In this course of this ascent, Stein makes free use of the doctrines of the Catholic Church. Okay, this brings me to an understanding of dahr or zaman. These are two Arabic terms that define a chronological and a chirological understanding of time. Now, chronological time is time that is measured, or quantitative time, clock time we call it. Chirological time is time of the decision, decisive time. It's time that actually exists in the moment. It's a moment of decision. So time as kairos is the point in time where no worldly correlation comes to appearance, where that time cannot be known neither in advance nor at the time of its arrival. Only with the eyes of some quasi-faith can it be properly encountered. It is the temporal dimension of decision. So I talk about these two because it will help us understand the diverse, not definitions, but perspectives of time that exists in Islam. Recently, just yesterday, I realized that the Islamic esotericism as a field of study is being taught in Europe. Islamic esotericism isn't being taught in the Middle East. Scholars of Islam kind of reject that understanding. They see it very similar to blasphemy, to kufr. But in reality, when we look at Ibn Arabi, when we look at Ibn Sina, we realize that to philosophically approach Islamic esotericism in specific provides us with a broader understanding of what time is in the context of faith, and what time is in the context of our spiritual, or the way our soul becomes more and more, grows, develops. So to understand the conceptual fluidity of temporality in the Quran and esoteric Muslim teachings peculiar to Islamic theology, I am suggesting a reflection on the Muslim concept of barzakh, the temporal horizon in and after death, in parallel with Stein's unique interpretation of the Ayoub. This will be underlined by expounding the relations between time and the soul's becoming in Islamic and Christian esoteric thought. Similar to the temporal dynamics of Barzakh, Stein's mysticism leads to her conceptualization of the Avim, divine, sanctified, or heavenly time, as a metaphysical and ontological category in her understanding of life fullness. For her, life after death and life in the Avim effectively preserve moments of the lives of the blessed as constituent to the possible reality of timelessness through divine communion. So, when we look at both Meister Eckhart and Ibn Arabi simultaneously in parallel, we realize that they both require a certain understanding of the dynamism of spiritual transformation and mystical experience. It will also emphasize the effectivity of cross-interpreting the philosophy and esotericism of both Eckhart and Ibn Arabi to further understand the phenomenality and spiritual embodiment of the soul. The significance lies in the significance of using Stein here to phenomenologically understand Ibn Arabi and Eckhart is based on her phenomenology of feelings, and it emphasizes the effectivity of cross-interpreting the Christian and Islamic philosophy and esotericism to further understand the soul, but understanding it based on it being the individual's core. So what is Islamic esotericism? As I was just saying earlier, although Western esotericism as a field of study has recently witnessed level of growth, it is thought that most scholars of Islam showed no interest in this field. It is necessary to dispense with this misconception and focus on the intricacies of both. Although this is a summarized study, it does accentuate the relationship between Islamic and Christian esotericism. So to start with this analysis, it is necessary to understand what mysticism in Islam means. So when we look at mysticism in Islam, we directly have to understand the esoteric dimensions of what are known as Sufism and Shi'ism. And from Shi'ism, we understand the Ismaili esotericism esoteric tradition. Shi'ism and Sufism, albeit in different ways and to different extents, reflect the intrinsic aspects of Islamic orthodoxy in its theological and universal framework as traditions and an all-encompassing truth contained within a form of revelation. The term esotericism is rarely used in Islamic studies. It is a term, in fact, implied to denote a Shia Gnosis tradition known as Irfan. This goes in line with Henry Corbin's use of the term esoteric to translate the Arabic terms batin and ghaib, both used to denote the words hidden, inward, or concealed. So we kind of directly gain an understanding that although the term esoteric isn't used, it is implied in the sense that that kind of knowledge is not open to anyone. You kind of need to develop your spiritual understanding, not only of yourself, but of your time, to gain that knowledge, that privilege, I would say. So the current reality of Shi'ism and Sufism, perceived as integral vehicles of the Islamic revelation, is too deep to be neglected or even brushed aside by historical, theological, or even political arguments. From a Sunni point of view, Sufism is cognate with Shi'ism since it has assimilated some Shi'i characteristics. From the Shi'i point of view, Sufism originated in Shi'ism. Shi'ism has always been understood based on the asrar, or secrets, the esoteric instructions of the Prophet, which many Shi'i authors have identified with the Shi'i doctrine of taqiyya, of concealment. Ibn Khaldun, interestingly, discusses the Sufis' assimilation to Shi'i religious features, saying that the Sufis thus become saturated with Shi'i theories. Through Al-Junayd, a Sufi sheikh, we understand that the practice of using the cloak, the khirka, had been adopted based on the fact that it was a tradition inaugurated by Imam Ali when he closed Al-Hasan al-Basri and influenced him into the mystic path. In his Al-Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun continues to suggest that Ali's precedence to the Sufis in mysticism smells strongly of pro-Shia sentiment. According to this and to other Sufi ideals, the Sufis were seen to have become enmeshed in the Shia. So I bring this up because it is interesting to... Sufism is recognized as a Sunni mystical school. For them to highlight the importance of some Shia traditions is interesting both theologically and politically. So, and when you read more and you contextualize the understanding between the Shias and the Sufis, you come to understand that Irfan has a significant role to play in how Muslims come to understand themselves in time and how they come to understand time itself. Because time doesn't necessarily stop after death. And this is interesting, and this is why I think it's important for us to read the Avium in parallel with the Barzakh. The Avium let me just So the Islamic world was from the outset characterized by a plurality of theological and philosophical currents. There always existed Neoplatonic schools that were more open to esoteric and hermetic doctrines, especially in the milieu of Shi'i and Sufi communities. So for Ibn al-Arabi expressed this dynamism of spiritual transformation and mystical experience through a process that sought motivation from the awareness of the tensions that exists between the temporal and divine realms, specifically conceptualizing time in the soul's becoming. So it's interesting here because when we look at Ibn Arabi's understanding of Irfan, he uses a method of what he calls maqamat, stations. The more you delve into what he calls being, wujud, the more you come to realize what it is to be on that station. So each station is technically a form of the formless. And the higher you go on these stations, the closer you get to what he calls nowhere. So, yeah. So we later come to this understanding of station of no station, and it is where the perfect man who has culminated in his self-understanding reaches the view from nowhere. So you have the station of no station, and then you have the view of nowhere. So these are two important things for me, at least, I think, because it creates a connection between God and nothing, which he calls Allah Huwa, not Allah Shay. So Allah Huwa is not him, capital H, so not God. So anything that exists in the nowhere exists out of God. So if we take these two understandings and we try to understand what it means to be, or what it means to be, I don't want to say alive, but aware, to feel in the barzakh. The question, however, is that he doesn't highlight whether death is an important characteristic here. So with Stein, she highlights that death is necessary. We die, and at death, our physical life ends, but it makes way for a kind of transformation, and that transformation is divine transformation, where we get to share time with God, almost. But with Ibn Arabi, it's interesting because he doesn't highlight death as a necessity. So we don't really understand if I get to climb the ladder of these stations through life or death, or I'm not sure. So according to Ibn Arabi, those who are able to reach the level and stand on the station of no station, the perfect man, is effectively a human analog of the non-delimited being, one that assumes every delimitation without itself being limited. So all kinds of asrar and secrets, genuine knowledge of God, comes not with a process of adding predicates to our language to capture the essence of the divine, but rather by stripping them away. So only when the soul adds absolutely nothing to its concept of God and abides by it in existence, does it truly understand God. Here, existence is united to what is most intimate and particular, the inner depth of the soul. Based on this understanding, the eternal being intersects with the temporal man. This brings us to this brought me to wanting to understand how or what the origin of Islamic esotericism is. So when we look at Islamic esotericism, we're quickly thrown back to pre-Islamic Arab esotericism. And in the pre-Islamic tradition of Arabia, known as the Jahiliyyah, the Arabs conceived time as rooted in their experience of dahr, an infinite extension of temporality that stretches into the horizon. In Jahiliyyah poetry, for instance, this dahr is portrayed as an almost mythical creature, a being of all devouring time. So you have dahr, an esoteric understanding of time with no end, time that is not historical necessarily. And then you have zaman, time that is historical, time that has an end. And Ibn Arabi actually plays with three concepts of time: waqt, zaman, and dahr. And I'm just, again, getting carried away. Very sorry. So such questions of existence, destiny, and eternal time in pre-Islamic Arabian poetry were ultimately related to pre-Semitic and Semitic mythology. Pre-Islamic Arabs embodied a doctrine that not only personified time, but de-edified it. This lineage reflects the philosophy and ethics that exists in poetry, consequently further developing the expression of zuhud, renunciations, and the genre of zuhdiyat in pre- and post-Islamic periods. So this is interesting because through this type of poetry, zuhdiyat, both pre-Islamic and post-Islamic Arabs were seen to give up everything to time, as if time was God. But later on, after Islam, we start seeing how God and dahr, specifically the esoteric understanding of time, are connected. They're used interchangeably. So yeah, here. This is contextualized and correlated use of Allah, God, and dahr can be traced back to an important hadith in which God is the speaker. God said, "Man insults me in blaming time. I am time." Time in both its chirological and chronological context is pervasive in Islamic history, and being so, it is central to the Arabic language. It allows us to understand everything. I realize that we have more than 33 terms for time in Arabic. It's quite overwhelming. Yeah, so in unconnected sections of his work, Ibn Arabi concocted a vision of time that links three principal notions which had been concurrent in Arab and Islamic discourse on temporality: dahr, zaman, and waqt. So waqt is understood as the atomistic notion of time, dahr as the esoteric vision of time, and zaman as the cosmological, historical understanding of time. They are very significant for Ibn Arabi because that's how he highlights what the barzakh is. So for Ibn Arabi, the barzakh is okay. Linguistically, etymologically, the barzakh is a barrier. In the Quran, it's used in two different ways. One, it's used in a way as a barrier of salty and sweet water. The second way is a barrier between the living and the dead. So the dead cannot influence the living, and the living cannot influence the dead. Now, this is interesting because the barzakh, we cannot understand anything about the barzakh, obviously. But it plays a very significant role to understand the afterlife. So for Muslims, the afterlife is as real as life itself. But you cannot touch it. None of us can touch it, or at least be aware of touching it and come talk about it later on. The importance of the barzakh is that Ibn Arabi uses it to create the possibility that time after death is a fact. And it's interesting because he kind of uses a sort of phenomenological approach to highlighting this fact. He talks about the development of the maqamat. So the more you develop in your maqam, the more you understand what time is, the more you realize that you are in the dahr, not the zaman. And it's interesting because if you're in the dahr, then the dahr doesn't end. There's no end to the dahr. What does that mean to you? Does that mean I don't end? Does that mean I do have an end, but not in the dahr? So there's a lot of questions that we start to ask ourselves because of Ibn Arabi's analysis. So for him, time is at once adam, non-existence, and is possessed of la wujud, no non-being, no being. So time is above nature, dahr is above nature, and then we have zaman, below nature, تحت الطبيعة, under nature. He also makes a connection between God and dahr by using the qalb, the heart. So the qalb, according to Ibn Arabi, is given its name because the heart, what we call in Arabic taqlib, taqallub, it moves, it switches, it pumps your heart. So for Ibn Arabi, God made our heart beat, so it would take in highlighting the changes of the heart, and these changes are already inclusive in dahr. So it is its inherent quality is transitional and is made to be altered. In the understanding that God is time, God undergoes this mechanism of transition by fashioning the forms, suwar, of creation. As such, the day, yawm, is the measure of the divine nafas, breath, that ensouls all living beings. By observing one's qalb, heart, the abode of Gnostic knowledge, which for Ibn Arabi is the essential and inherent drive of the aql, mind, the intellect, the individual soul is at once united with God and completely knows God. This knowledge does not come in the form of reason, not even of faith, but as the ground of every act of knowing of the soul and its very own existence. So for Ibn Arabi and Meister Eckhart, any understanding of the dialectical nature of a relationship with God essentially springs from the revealed text and assumes a certain level of meaning and existential significance for the individual, only insofar as it is directed towards the understanding of the experience of revelation. So this is how the soul experiences the truth of existence through time. Out of this experience comes a fullness of an understanding of God. And this is interesting because Stein uses this concept of the fullness of life to highlight that only through a full life is the Avim possible. So if we connect Stein and Ibn Arabi on the same page, if you may, maybe what Ibn Arabi was moving towards is a kind of fullness of life. So a fullness of life which translates into a full understanding of time. Because only through a full life, for Stein, can you participate in divine temporality. And what's interesting even further for Stein is that the time that we share with God is not divine temporality in specific, but it is temporality that is just beneath God a bit. It is the time of the angels, she says. Yeah, okay. So when posited, this means that the very non-existence of either termination points of time can be said to equal pre-eternity or eternity. The only permanence, however, is present time, the moment of the now. When posited, the now affirms the reciprocity of time between God and the world. In the now, both God's eternity as well man's chirological moment exists simultaneously. Intuitively, then, such sages and mystics seek to contain the cluster of nows in a zarf, a vessel, where only imagination can conceive of the unity of the temporal and divine realms. And this is interesting because Ibn Arabi, at the end, gives a high significance to imagination, to what imagination means and how imagination plays a role in our understanding of time. We have seen in what ways Ibn Arabi's understanding of aql and time can be read phenomenologically. Simultaneously, spirit or the ruh is embodied in the heart and the soul nafs of man, and it is only when the aql is restored in the qalb, the heart, that our primordial nature is regained and admitted. Fully realizing the highest level of awareness, we become the perfect man. So this fullness of time coincides with a spiritual fullness. And we can understand this using both Ibn Arabi and Edith Stein. Like awakening an inward eye of the heart that sees the fullness of reality as it is truly manifested. Ibn Arabi details a hermeneutics of a science of the soul through which wayfaring souls can make a return to the divine. So this is something else that interests me. So when he says making a return to the divine, is that after death? Is that through our understanding of the different maqamat, the higher our maqam, the closer we are to a return to God? So Ibn Arabi sees authentic existence in God, whose essence is at the same time his existence. Accordingly, we exist authentically only towards the degree that we are not imprisoned in the chronos of our temporality. Instead, authentic life for us begins when God's eternity is embraced through the heart, allowing the realization of a fullness of time that not only realizes itself, but does so in a dynamic of constant flow of manifestations. In this fullness, divine temporality is not an abstract now that is motionless and solely corresponds to a particular concept, form, or manifestation. Instead, this fullness stipulates the kairos in the soul's assumption of divine traits as its own. In light of Stein's phenomenological insight, where the heart symbolizes the bodily organ to which embodiment and activity to life is tied, we find no difficulty in our ability to picture the heart as the inner being of the soul. That it is the heart that evidently holds the greatest share in its inner processes, and is the space where the interconnection between soul and body is mostly experienced and strikingly felt. We come to understand the appropriation of divine being, which is unconcealed for Ibn Arabi, based on the intellect's nature to know, and can only come through the heart. In conforming itself to the theater of divine manifestations, the heart actually comes in behind the manifestation so as to fully embrace the concealment of divine attributes and the unconcealment of God, hence embracing that which is divine itself. It is through this temporal chirological fullness of the heart that one enters divine being, appropriating its traits as one's own. And here I'll be talking about the barzakh and the avim, just little small notes here and there. So the barzakh is not specifically an Arab term. But it's also not a foreign term either. It comes specifically from Middle Persian as farsang or farsangan, or Greek, I don't know how to say that word, and indicates a tract of land, hence a barrier or isthmus. The term barzakh is the crux of intersection between time and eternity. Its interpretation as a barrier is emphasized as a result of its contextualization in Surah 25 and 55 of the Quran, to explain the divine ability to separate two cosmic seas of sweet and salt water. Indeed, God made the barzakh as much as to keep the dead away from interfering with the living, as the living interfering with the dead. We said that. What I wanted to highlight is, so yeah, here. So there is a verse in the Quran, and it says it discusses a scene, and this scene basically takes place after death, and it is about a man who, it's about a man and his donkey. God made him die 100 years, and after raising him, God questions him, "How long hast thou tarried?" He responds, "I have tarried a day or part of a day." God tells him, "Nay, thou hast tarried 100 years." Now, this is interesting for me because it shows one that man feels after death. So if man was able to feel that he has tarried a day or more than a day, it shows that there are some conscious faculties that we still retain after death in the barzakh. So this highlights either time in the barzakh, time after the barzakh, or the ability for us to actually be aware of feelings of time, of the clock, of chronological time in the barzakh. And I'll just stop here. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. First of all, as most of you did, I would like to thank Olli for organizing all of this and making this to happen and gathering all of us here. Today, I am going to talk about a certain forgotten or even not so commonly known case in contemporary esotericism, or to be exact, in contemporary ritual magic. I will talk about Peter Hamilton-Giles' occult philosophy. And I have additional note to make before I am going to start reading my presentation. It is this presentation I have already presented in some way at the last ESWE conference. So someone who were with could be familiar with the topic, but I changed something a little bit, made it a little bit clearer, and also complicated it a little bit too. So, esotericism as an overarching term includes a diverse array of different worldviews and belief systems. It is already a unique set of ideas that usually requires an accompanying and clearly expressed practical dimension. Usually, the difference between its theory and practice of esotericism is quite rigidly delineated. On one hand, we have conceptual frameworks offering various interpretations of the world, and on the other, we have a set of pragmatic tools to achieve those envisioned goals. However, such strict typological binaries rarely exist in reality. In this context, as one of the constructs found in between, I propose considering the concept of theory practice, which could serve as a definition of a function that theory plays as practice. Each of the members of this conjunction must be treated equally without prioritizing one over the other. This implies that neither theory nor practice has a foundational status. Moreover, from this could be inferred that theory is a certain practice and practice is a certain theory. Then what are the implications for esoteric practice? Actually, also a note must be made that while bearing in mind the huge ramifications which could follow after choosing a particular name for the practice exemplified, I am not going to differentiate between such adjectives as esoteric, occult, magical, and witchcraft, and here we'll use them interchangeably. Despite the proposed equality of theory and practice in the theory practice, here I would like to highlight the theoretical aspect of which has been sometimes overlooked while studying esotericism. While much has been debated about the rationality of esotericism, less attention has been given to its inherent reflectivity. Consequently, much has been done to resituate esotericism in the field of historical, social, and cultural studies through the questioning of constructs that deem it irrational. So I believe that there are cases to be found where reflection as an aspect of the theoretical enterprise becomes an important part of esoteric practice. Certainly, it has been noticed throughout many studies before, such as Tanya Slurman's The Persuasions of Witchcraft or Agilas Prem's The Problem of Disenchantment, that critical reflectivity often accompanies the practices of esotericists. So, to distinguish my inquiry from what has already been discerned by our scholars of the field, I am going to introduce another term referring to the metacognitive or the second-order reflection. A methodological distinction must be made between the two interlinked terms, reflectivity and meta-reflectivity. I will call reflectivity the representation of activity and meta-reflectivity the representation of reflectivity itself. To give an example, and it is useful to take it from the context of ritual magic, one thing is to reflect on how to do better magic, while another is to reflect that to reflect is already an act of magic. That's why here we should talk about the theoretical aspect of esoteric practice, all the way remembering the important point to be made that here we will also eventually come upon practice. And this I express through the already mentioned term, the theory practice. Hence, without having an ambition to empirically verify the latter hypothesis by enlisting everyone in the field of esotericism, I will focus on one notable exception, Peter Hamilton-Giles and his occult philosophy. In conjunction with an examination of the case of esotericism, I aim to present a function that theory could have in the occult practice by introducing the concept of theory practice and explicating the role which meta-reflectivity and as an aspect of theory practice could play in occult practice. I hope that one additional aim will be shown during the analysis, and it is the importance of the inclusion of philosophical perspective into the study of esotericism. To discuss Hamilton-Giles and his occult philosophy requires us to start from the relatively understudied phenomenon of traditional witchcraft. Only a few scholarly studies have been presented so far, while the material from the practitioners themselves is still expanding and thriving. Among better-known publishing houses in this field include the Free Hands Press, Sonon, Scarlet Imprint, Anathema Publishing, Theon Publishing, and Atramentus Press. Proponents who choose to use traditional witchcraft label primarily seek to discern themselves from the Wicca movement, which modern orientation and lately received criticism about its historical inauthenticity is sought to be overcome by a claim towards another pre-Wiccan tradition of witchcraft. Among the most prominent organizational bodies could be enlisted Robert Cochrane's Clan of Tubal-Cain, usually presented as the forerunner of so-called traditional witchcraft, and Andrew D. Chambly's Cultus Sabbati. Hamilton-Giles himself collaborated with Chambly under the auspices of Dragon's Column, resulting in the publishment of Dragon Book of Essex, but has never belonged to Cultus Sabbati itself. Since his founding of a tremendous press in 2016, he has published an extensive collection of works dedicated towards the expansion of reflection upon the philosophical and anthropological issues of occultism and witchcraft. His publishing house has also gathered several other authors with similar aims. And you could see here on the screen the statement that could be found at the website of our stage, just pointing, within giving an emphasis on their aims of their publishing house, of the aims of their publishing house. Nevertheless, Hamilton-Giles books are not purely theoretical enterprises, but also serve as practical manuals where, I will argue, theoretical considerations function as a form of occult practice itself. It is a highly ambitious project which requires its readers to be acquainted not only with different esoteric currents, but likewise be prepared to discuss the intricacies of Ricoeur's conceptualization of mimesis in his narrative theory, Husserl's phenomenology of internal time consciousness, or Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception. But before delving into the philosophical intricacies, one fundamental issue must be addressed beforehand, which is also will serve as an introduction to technicalities, the question about the reality of traditional witchcraft. Ethan Doyle White, in one of the excellent recent articles about traditional witchcraft, raised the latter question, concluding that it is invalid to speak about the reality of traditional witchcraft from an ethic perspective, and that it functions only as an emic notion. White argues that claims about the reality of traditional witchcraft is a discursive strategy. First, to distinguish it from Wicca, and second, to evoke legitimation by tradition. While I do not disagree with the general tendency that the traditional witchcraft term is often used as a tool of a discursive strategy, I think that we could still find an ethic usage of traditional witchcraft if we, first of all, differentiate between its broad and narrow ethic interpretations. Even if the name of traditional witchcraft is mostly exhausted discursively, there are still instances where the treatment of tradition itself differs and does not fit the requirements of historical legitimization. Hamilton-Giles' colleague Chambly defines his approach in this manner. Quote, Sabbatic craft describes a corpus of magical practices which self-consciously utilize the imagery and mythos of the witches' Sabbath as a cipher of ritual teaching and gnosis. This is not the same as saying that one practices the self-same rituals in the self-same manner as the purported early modern witches or historically attested cunning folk. Rather, it points towards the fact that the very mythos which had been generated about both witches and their ritual gatherings has been appropriated and reoriented by contemporary successors of cunningcraft, observance, and then knowingly applied for their own purposes, unquote. From this quote, it can be seen that no simple binary between the existence or non-existence of historical tradition is stated. The latter divide must be a necessary condition for the polemical discourse to emerge. There is none. The self-conscious acknowledgement of the mythical status of the witchcraft tradition diminishes the purpose of legitimation by tradition. Despite this, a positive value can be derived from such a stance. without having as a name to legitimize their practices and base it upon the factual claims about the existence of historical continuity of tradition, some traditional witchcraft practitioners are self-aware about the constructed nature of their rituals. Hence, where a broad ethic usage of traditional witchcraft term would require a factual basis to ground the claim about the existence of such tradition, that would be different from other contemporary witchcraft movements. A narrow ethic usage of traditional witchcraft term would point to a different epistemological stance about what the belief in itself means. While the traditional witchcraft movement comes as a reaction to the Wicca movement with an attempt to deconstruct the historical legitimacy of its previous existence, so the narrow ethic notion, where it could be traced, would mark the impact towards the general epistemological understanding of what does it mean to practice witchcraft and what is in the concept of the witchcraft itself. Hamilton-Giles begins to explain this further, and I'm quoting him again. Quote, "The witching hour is the culmination of a relationship with a character that is only ever partial, yet it is this apparent lack in detail and meaning by which people have built a venerable belief system. While some witch-oriented practitioners may balk at the suggestion that what most are doing is culturally appropriating many centuries worth of partial narratives, all of which conceal the complete story. This is the reason for the acculturation in the first place. However, with the witching hour, I go to the heart of the matter. What we do know is that we do not know very much, that there is in fact an implicit othering in what we do. How we then relate to the witch must derive from something other than that which has been recorded. Accordingly, the witch is not exactly a witch, but is rather placed in motion from records related to having undertaken specific deeds. This creates the doing witching, while the silences and absences in the text create the other. The premise is relatively simple. If we agree that the witch in part remains unknown to us, that it is indeed the act of doing or having done something which identifies a person, past or present, then it is not the witch alone, but his or her connection to otherness, to the silences, absences, and censorship in texts, which gives us license to use our imagination. It is therefore from what we don't know rather than from what we do which allows us to open ourselves up to possibilities and the development of belief," unquote. Hamilton-Giles acknowledges the lack of concrete proof about the historical reality of witchcraft tradition, though these gaps of history, while being alien to a historian, on the contrary, could be productive for a practitioner himself. To illustrate this, let me deconstruct Hamilton-Giles' concept of the witching hour and explain its components separately. In this kind of occult philosophy, it could be said that the other is treated as an essential Hegelian bedrock for reflection to originate. To be able to think something, identity and sameness must be interrupted. Something else or something different than itself must intervene. In other words, our knowledge rests upon non-knowledge, or presence rests upon absence. To reflect upon this relationship is not only to actively reflect in general, because reflection already begins with the passive interaction with the other, without a necessity to know the structure itself of the relationship. Whereas to reflect upon this relationship is to enable meta-reflection. The other part of the term, witching, could be explained as an agentive concept that mediates between knowledge and non-knowledge, or presence and absence. It signifies the action that bridges these states, allowing for the dynamic interplay between them. This conceptual framework highlights how practitioners can engage with the gaps in historical knowledge, using them as a space for creative and reflective practice. The latter duality between presence and absence is an important conceptuality for Hamilton-Giles occult philosophy. First, before going deeper into the explication of the witching hour, a brief excursus must be made explaining the particular role of these concepts. Through the phenomenological perspective, that becomes one of the theoretical building blocks for Hamilton-Giles occult philosophy. It could be seen that the analysis of what appears could be mainly focused on what is present in our experience. However, phenomenological investigations is not only concerned with the analysis of directly appearing phenomena, as in descriptive phenomenology, but the questions about reconstitution are also included in the field of transcendental phenomenology. In this case, that what is present is complexified by that what comes under the structure or appearing itself and becomes a shadowy part of constitution. By associating occult philosophy and its practice with the discourse of the other, Hamilton-Giles raises the question about the possibility to know and work with that what is absent, thereby making transcendental phenomenology an inevitable consequence of his inquiry. He emphasizes that through the analysis of what is absent, we could not avoid making it into something present to us, a process he describes as the dialectics of standing in the crossroads. One thing would be to choose between one of the members of dialectics, be it presence or absence, but the author is more inclined towards the description of the process of how absence is turned into presence, or in general, what is happening in the space in between. His explanation is more oriented to the acknowledgement that a occult practitioner is the one who is not only concerned with making invisible forces appear, but that actual practice is the working with that which does not exist, or absence, and only through the slippage it intervenes into presence. In phenomenology, what is beyond experience is the metaphysical and does not straightforwardly figure in our field of appearance. By this token, Hamilton-Giles' absence and the other conceptualizes this accordingly as being metaphysical in nature. Consequently, what does not exist or what is not present is treated as being the primary object of occult practitioner. In this framework, the field of not-existence offers potential for inventing experience, while simultaneously being self-aware of the stemming from the absence. For instance, an empirically verifiable strategy has a clear decisional framework between the existence and non-existence of objects. If spirits cannot be verified to exist, they are deemed non-existent. Hamilton-Giles occult philosophy, however, takes a different approach. If a spirit does not exist, then it is for the better. Even if the factual reality of witchcraft does not exist, its absence still has consequences for invention or real effects for our grappling with its absence. This position does not negate the empirical reality of existence, but helps to complexify the relationship with non-existence and imaginal faculties accompanying the inquiry of occult practitioner. Returning to the analysis of the witching hour, the concept of witching becomes a practice of creating something where nothing exists, while maintaining the creation in alignment with the quality of otherness. Reflecting upon the witching and doing the witching become intertwined, whereas separation of them into different domains is attempted, but only with the descriptive phenomenological purpose in mind. Because every such differentiation is also a certain act of witching, where more and more parts of the other are revealed. Even the witch as a certain witch image is affected by this process. And I quote Hamilton-Giles again. Quote, because the witching remains remote due to our inability to know about that which does not exist as an interiorized agency in the experiential world of the beholder, has led me to deduce the which encapsulates in part anti-presence. And so the glimpse that which fascinates, being in essence neither here or there, the witching hour, unquote. This explanation underscores why theory becomes practice in Hamilton-Giles occult philosophy. One of the necessary conditions for a theory is the existence of the subject that makes it and for whom it exists. But what if the subject has no history and becomes knowable and becomes unknowable and ungraspable? Then the empirical verification of its direct existence is impossible. Though there is no contradiction in the desire to perpetually create various fictional narratives about it. Hamilton-Giles does not seek to provide evidence for the existence of historical witchcraft tradition. Instead, he focuses on understanding how witchcraft is practiced and what occurs during this practice. As I aim to demonstrate, this kind of practice is not pure practice in opposition to theory, but is rigorously accompanied by theory, forming a theory-practical approach. Throughout Hamilton-Giles occult philosophy, it could be seen that essential is not only the ways of how to make tools required for the accomplishment of a successful ritual, but the means of conceptualization and reinvention of theory about what is witchcraft itself become parts of the practice. Rebuilding the theory of what is meant by a witch, witchcraft, occult, and etc. enables the reflectivity upon the stable images that were previously instantiated and has been associated with a certain tradition that could since then be creatively reinvented. This particular reflection on what has been said and what has been left unsaid requires the introduction of hermeneutical tactics, where the gaps in the present are traced. Absence serves as a potentially blank page where anything could be eventually written. Being in between, this inability to say something and to be accordingly enchanted by the topic is the subject of Hamilton-Giles occult philosophy and its leading concept of the witching other. Otherness seems to be primarily associated with something standing at a distance, but the positive valence is always prevalent. So I'm quoting Hamilton-Giles. As much as the object of fascination is in transcendence, it is equally important to experience its potential to adumbrate. In its difference to self, the object becomes a constant symbol for negotiation. Its appearance is, however, challenged by having acquired an awareness, and it is this which generates the irreflective form, this being the key to the sorcerer's condition, unquote. Awareness encompasses more than just facilitating negotiation with the subject making a claim. As I have mentioned earlier, it has its particular quality which differentiates it from the sameness, and an ability to be otherwise. And according to Hamilton-Giles, this quality is sought after by the practitioners. Strictly speaking, awareness must be introduced to be able to eventually come upon that which what Hamilton-Giles calls the irreflective. I quote him again. The irreflective constitutes a coming together of moments as part of an internalized continuum, unquote. The concept of the I reflective can be understood as the function that reflection serves for the subject. It gathers the different parts of a unified experiential field, which is given in a Kantian fashion. Specifically, our experience is not merely passively given, but is a negotiable and reconciliable field, and this is encompassed by the concept of the I reflective. That is important for my statement about the inherent meta-reflection in Hamilton-Giles occult philosophy and his theory practice. It must be emphasized that reflection and meta-reflection must be distinguished. Where reflection is concerned with the ability to represent, meta-reflection is a faculty that is the second order reflection by which the structure of representing itself is reflected upon. Hamilton-Giles discusses the concept of the self that differentiates it from the concept of the other. And in this case, the self could be seen as related to primary reflection, standing in confrontation with the other that lends a difference to it and with whom it is in a reflective relationship. Drawing on a Husserlian theory of self-awareness, it is possible to see that here the pre-reflective and reflective phases of self-awareness is pointed out. In other words, self is in a constant relationship with not only what is cognized upon, but with what is perceived too. It is not necessary to additionally represent in order to experience being in a relationship with the other. Practical engagement has a participation of subjectivity in it too. However, when questions about this relationship and the activity inherent to it are raised, the second order of reflection or meta-reflection emerges. It is one thing to be self-aware of the object and completely another to be self-aware of the process itself. And this later ability is what Hamilton-Giles calls the I reflective, that comes after a primal instantiation of the self. While focusing upon the primary field of reflection, the otherness additionally has a pure phenomenological aspect as it is present in Husserl's, Sartre's, or Lebanese approaches. The other evokes a new epistemological position that should not have to come from a subject or object alone, but is intersubjective. We are as individuals, not isolated atoms, but always in a social relationship with someone else or the other. This other even helps us to recognize our own constitution as being constructed and coming from somewhere else. That is why Hamilton-Giles states that before accepting the act of ditching the constitution of self as being formed from how before accepting the act of ditching, quote, the constitution of self as being formed from how we have encountered others, unquote, must be acknowledged. And the awareness of the other in the constitution of the self is only one part of the story. Quote, conscious formations captivate the world with form, embodying conditions of the object when placed in relation to I, makes tactile the possibility of further exploration. The I of self as subject is therefore bound to the formation of the I as object, unquote. By this quote, I think that Hamilton-Giles seems to suggest that the witching over when an attempt is made to define it, despite its lack of a strictly determinable position as a subject, is transformed into an object. The otherness of a subject gives something new through the object to play a role in the process of becoming. This reflects a classical schema of reflection, where there is the I that reflects upon, or as it could be expressed in the classical phenomenological or Husserlian terminology as transcendental ego, and the I that is reflected upon as an empirical ego. Despite its simplicity, it could be argued that here, particularly the meta-reflective possibility of I reflective becomes visible. The acknowledgement of possibility to change objects at hand and even make an object out of a subject reorients the investigations towards the structuring of the process itself that shows the constructional nature of narratives, images, and concepts, and enables the re-evaluation of them. It looks like that every coming into a relationship with the other by Hamilton-Giles is treated as a reflection which, if reflected upon itself, the direction towards the otherness is the act of witching. And the last quote from Hamilton-Giles' text, quote, some might ask, why should any of this matter when working the crooked path? The point being made here is that it is impossible to effectively work the path unless one understands how we go about constructing the appropriate interface between various states of being and non-being. As has already been showed, it is simply not enough to blindly accept what another has told you. The correct response when partaking in knowledge is to explore the intricacies that are helping you to deconstruct the given. We can even extend this further by noting it is the duty of a sorcerer to deconstruct givenness, to not assume the sanctuary of knowledge is enough. What this endeavor is advising you to do is to reflect upon sorcerer's consciousness and understand that the presence and absence of being optimizes the relational quality between physical and metaphysical dimensions. It is, after all, a simple request to not accept what you are being told, for there is magic to be found in understanding the process of informing your decisions. And so it is that we choose to apply perceptual apprehension to comprehend multiple adumbrations that have already taken place, and with the darkness of unknowing encroaches upon the self and makes from it our demeanor, unquote. It is intriguing to observe a similarity between Hamilton-Giles' understanding of magic and Randall Steyer's approach to the conceptualization of magic itself. Steyer's, in his monumental study, Making Magic, Religion, Magic, and Science in the Modern World, tells that theorists of magic, aiming to dispel beliefs in the power of words, have often employed a similar strategy by creating new meanings to advance magical discourse. In a similar vein, Hamilton-Giles' occult philosophy could be seen as an experiment with the latter proposal through a self-aware acknowledgement that a certain theory of magic produces magic, and by this is itself a form of magic. In conclusion, I would like to say that from a particular analysis of Hamilton-Giles' occult philosophy, it could be seen that not only the theoretical considerations in general could be important for an occult practice, but the theory itself could be a part of the occult practice. Theory practice, presented by Hamilton-Giles as the act of witching. Moreover, it could be noticed that meta-reflectivity is an aspect of occult theory practice, enabling a change, in this case conceptualized by Hamilton-Giles as the witching hour. Obviously, while including meta-reflection into the esoteric practice, the binary between emicentetic perspectives is complexified. And I hope that additionally, the importance of the inclusion of philosophical perspective into the study of esotericism has been showed. Thank you. Also, I think that I should mention that Peter Hamilton-Giles' texts are quite vastly illustrated, and you had been able to see those illustrations made by his wife, Caroline Hamilton-Giles.